In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a lavish party at Willow Hall turns deadly when a guest, Arthur Langley, collapses after biting into a poisoned peach from a stunning fruit basket. As whispers of murder ripple through the elegant crowd, the sharp-eyed Miss Marple unravels a web of secrets, financial desperation, bitter rivalries, and hidden debts. Among the host, the caterer, a tearful friend, and a vengeful rival. With a faint sheen on grapes and a discolored leaf as her clues, she exposes a calculated killer in just 30 seconds, proving that even the sweetest fruit can hide a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from the garden, mingling with the soft clink of china, as Miss Marple poured herself a second cup of tea. Her knitting lay in a neat pile beside her, a half-finished scarf in pale blue wool, but her attention was fixed on a cream-colored envelope that had arrived with the morning post. The paper was thick, embossed with a subtle crest, and addressed in an elegant, looping hand that suggested both wealth and intention. Miss Marple, with her sharp, bird-like eyes, slit the envelope open with a silver letter knife, her movements precise despite her age. The invitation inside was from Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a recent arrival to the village, who had taken up residence at Willow Hall, a Georgian manor that had stood empty since old Colonel Bantry's passing. The event was to be a grand affair, a celebration of the autumn harvest, promising an evening of music, conversation, and a buffet, to rival the finest tables in London. The centerpiece, the invitation noted with a flourish, would be a fruit basket, a masterpiece of nature's bounty, brimming with the season's finest offerings. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. She had seen many such displays in her time, and they often concealed more than they revealed, about both the host and the guests. St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene, there thrived on the undercurrents of gossip and intrigue, and Mrs. Grayson had already stirred the village's curiosity. A widow of considerable means, she had arrived with little explanation, her past a tapestry of vague rumors about a late husband in trade and distant connections to minor aristocracy. Miss Marple, who had a knack for piecing together such fragments, found the woman's sudden prominence intriguing. The invitation, with its careful wording and lavish promises, suggested a desire to impress, perhaps to mask some deeper unease. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the guest list, which Mrs. Grayson had thoughtfully included. Among the names were several that piqued her interest. Mr. Arthur Langley, a jovial businessman known for his shrewd dealings, was to attend, no doubt, drawn by the prospect of new connections. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, was a local man whose ambition had outgrown the village's modest demands. His involvement promised a spectacle, but also pressure. Mr. Harold Vance, a rival to Langley in matters of commerce, was a surprising inclusion, given their well-known enmity over a recent contract. And Miss Clara Bell, a young woman of charm and uncertain means, was noted as a close friend of Langley's, though the nature of their bond was unclear. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the invitation, her mind already tracing the threads of human nature that would converge at Willow Hall. She set the invitation down and glanced out the window, where the roses in her garden nodded in the breeze. Parties, in her experience, were rarely just parties. They were stages where vanities, rivalries, and secrets played out, often with unintended consequences. The fruit basket, so proudly described, struck her as an odd focal point. Why emphasize it so? Was it mere ostentation, or did it hold some significance she could not yet discern? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene, but her mind alight with possibilities. She would attend, of course, not for the music or the buffet, but for the chance to observe, to listen, and to unravel whatever lay beneath the polished surface of Mrs. Grayson's gathering. With a final glance at the invitation, she rose to select a suitable dress, something understated. As always, for Miss Marple knew the value of blending into the background. The evening at Willow Hall promised to be more than a celebration. It was, she sensed, the opening act of a drama, yet to unfold. Chapter 2. The Gathering. The autumn evening draped St. Mary Mead in a soft golden haze as Miss Jane Marple stepped from her modest cottage, her black lace shawl drawn snugly over her shoulders. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, and the sky above Willow Hall glowed with the last embers of sunset. The manor, its honey-colored stone facade illuminated by flickering lanterns, stood as a beacon of grandeur against the encroaching dusk. Miss Marple, her steps measured but purposeful, approached the iron gates, her sharp eyes already scanning the arriving guests. She had attended many such gatherings in her long life, and she knew them to be microcosms of human nature, places where smiles masked motives and pleasantries veiled truths. Inside, Willow Hall was a vision of opulence. The entrance hall gleamed with polished marble, its high ceiling adorned with a chandelier that scattered prisms of light across the walls. A string quartet played a gentle Vivaldi piece, the notes floating above the hum of conversation. Servants in crisp uniforms moved deftly among the guests, offering flutes of champagne and delicate canapes. Miss Marple accepted a glass with a polite nod, her attention drawn to the dining room, where the promised fruit basket held court. It was a magnificent creation, a wicker cornucopia overflowing with glossy apples, velvety peaches, golden pears, and clusters of grapes that shimmered like amethysts. The basket sat on a linen-draped table, surrounded by crystal candelabras that cast a warm glow over its bounty. Guests paused to admire it, their murmurs of appreciation mingling with the music. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the host, stood near the basket, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald gown catching the candlelight. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with a face that suggested both beauty and strain, as if the effort of maintaining her composure was a constant battle. She greeted each guest with a radiant smile, but Miss Marple noted the fleeting glances she cast toward the door, as if expecting someone or something to disrupt the evening's harmony. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice warm but tinged with a nervous edge. "I do hope you'll enjoy the evening. The fruit basket is quite the talk, isn't it?" "Quite remarkable," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes lingering on the basket. "Such a display must have taken great care to arrange." Mrs. Grayson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she turned to greet another guest, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the significance of her unease. The room was filling with the village's notables and a few strangers from beyond St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple positioned herself near a velvet-curtained window, her small, bird-like figure unobtrusive, yet perfectly placed to observe. She noted Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, a wiry man with a shock of dark hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. He darted between the kitchen and the dining room, adjusting platters and whispering instructions to his staff. His pride in his work was evident, but so was his anxiety, as if the success of the evening rested solely on his shoulders. Miss Marple recalled village gossip about Reed's ambition to expand his catering business, a venture that depended on the goodwill of patrons like Mrs. Grayson and perhaps others present tonight. Across the room, Mr. Arthur Langley held court among a cluster of guests, his booming laugh cutting through the music. A robust man in his 50s, with a ruddy complexion and a penchant for loud waistcoats, Langley was a businessman whose charm masked a ruthless streak. He was regaling a young couple with a story of his latest triumph, something about a contract won in London. Miss Marple, who had heard of his dealings through her nephew Raymond, knew Langley's success had made him enemies. One such enemy stood in a shadowed corner, his face a study in controlled resentment. Mr. Harold Vance, Langley's business rival. Vance was a lean, hawkish man, his dark suit as severe as his expression. His eyes followed Langley with an intensity that Miss Marple found unsettling, though he made no move to approach. She wondered what had prompted Mrs. Grayson to invite both men, given their well-known feud. Nearby, Miss Clara Bell sparkled like a jewel in a sapphire dress, her laughter bright and infectious. She was young, perhaps 25, with a cascade of golden curls and a manner that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She flitted from group to group, her conversation animated, her gestures expansive. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of behavior, noticed a certain calculation in Clara's movements. She lingered longest near Langley, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she laughed at his jokes. Was it affection, Miss Marple wondered, or something more strategic? Clara's background was murky. Village rumor painted her as a friend of Langley's, perhaps a protégé, but there were whispers of debts and obligations that bound them. As the evening progressed, the guests began to gravitate toward the buffet, a lavish spread of roasted pheasant, smoked salmon, and delicate pastries. But it was the fruit basket that drew the most attention. A young woman in a lilac gown reached for an apple, only to be gently dissuaded by Reed, who appeared at her side with a tray of tarts. "The basket is more for display until later," he said, his voice tight. "We've plenty of other delights for now." The woman nodded, but Miss Marple caught the brief flash of irritation in Reed's eyes as he glanced at the basket. Was he protecting his creation, or something else? Miss Marple sipped her champagne, her gaze moving from one suspect to another. Mrs. Grayson, now engaged in conversation with Dr. Haydock, the local physician, seemed to be forcing her laughter. Reed, returning to the kitchen, wiped his hands repeatedly on his apron, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as a sign of nervous distraction. Vance, still in his corner, had not touched the food or drink, his attention fixed on Langley, who was now helping himself to a second glass of brandy. Clara, meanwhile, had drifted closer to the fruit basket, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as she chatted with a young man. Miss Marple's mind catalogued these details, her thoughts weaving a tapestry of possibilities. People, she knew, were rarely what they seemed, and gatherings like this one were fertile ground for secrets to surface. The quartet struck up a livelier tune, and a few couples began to dance in the adjoining drawing room. Miss Marple declined an invitation to join, preferring her vantage point. She noticed Vance finally move, his steps deliberate as he approached the buffet table. He paused near the fruit basket, his hand hovering over a cluster of grapes before he withdrew it, as if reconsidering. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Was it a casual gesture, or had he been checking something? She made a mental note to watch him closely. Mrs. Grayson, meanwhile, had excused herself from Dr. Haydock and was now circulating among the guests, her smile fixed, but her eyes darting toward the basket. Miss Marple wondered what it was about the display that seemed to preoccupy her. Had she chosen it herself, or had someone, perhaps Reed, insisted on its prominence? The old lady's thoughts were interrupted by a burst of laughter from Langley, who had just finished another anecdote. Clara was at his side again, her expression one of rapt attention. Miss Marple, who had seen many such performances, sensed a thread of tension beneath Clara's charm. Was she truly devoted to Langley, or was her loyalty a facade? As the clock struck 9, the atmosphere grew merrier, the champagne flowing freely. Miss Marple, who rarely indulged, set her glass aside and moved closer to the fruit basket, her curiosity piqued by its allure. Up close, she could see the care that had gone into its arrangement. The peaches were perfectly ripe, their skins blushing with a soft fuzz. The apples gleamed as if polished, and the grapes, heavy and lustrous, seemed almost too perfect. She leaned in, her nose detecting a faint, unfamiliar scent. Not the sweetness of fruit, but something sharper, almost chemical. Before she could investigate further, Reed appeared, his face pale. "Miss Marple, perhaps you'd like to try the quince jelly tarts? They're quite the specialty tonight." His tone was polite, but his eyes were anxious, and Miss Marple allowed herself to be steered away, her suspicions deepening. The evening wore on, the guests oblivious to the undercurrents Miss Marple sensed. She watched as Langley, now slightly flushed from the brandy, approached the fruit basket. "A fine peach, that's what I fancy," he declared, his voice carrying across the room. He reached for a particularly plump specimen, its golden hue glowing in the candlelight. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though she could not say why. She glanced at Vance, whose eyes were fixed on Langley, with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Mrs. Grayson, too, seemed to freeze, her hand tightening on her fan. Clara, standing nearby, turned away, her smile faltering for the first time. Langley took a bite of the peach, his expression one of delight. "Superb," he proclaimed, juice glistening on his chin. The room seemed to exhale, the tension Miss Marple had felt dissipating for a moment. But her unease remained, a quiet certainty that something was amiss. She had seen too many gatherings unravel, too many smiles hide malice, to dismiss her instincts. The fruit basket with its flawless bounty was more than a centerpiece. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to solve it before the evening took a darker turn. As the quartet played on and the guests continued their revelry, Miss Marple resumed her quiet observation, her mind sifting through the details. Mrs. Grayson's nervous glances, Reed's overzealous protection of the basket, Vance's brooding presence, and Clara's calculated charm. Each was a piece in the intricate mosaic of the evening, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere among them lay the truth. She settled back into her corner, her knitting untouched but her eyes as sharp as ever, ready to catch the first hint of the drama she sensed was about to unfold. Chapter 3. The Tragedy. The grand dining room of Willow Hall shimmered with the warmth of candlelight, the string quartet's melody weaving through laughter and clinking glasses. Miss Jane Marple stood near the velvet-curtained window, her small figure almost invisible amidst the swirl of elegant gowns and tailored suits. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing. The fruit basket, that opulent centerpiece, continued to draw admiring glances, its glossy peaches and lustrous grapes gleaming like jewels. Yet Miss Marple's attention was fixed not on the display, but on the people around it, their movements and expressions betraying the subtle tensions she had sensed from the moment she arrived. Mr. Arthur Langley, his face flushed from brandy and good humor, was the center of a small crowd, his booming voice recounting a tale of a recent business triumph. His loud waistcoat, a garish shade of crimson, stood out against the muted tones of the room, as did his confidence. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the fruit basket, as if drawn irresistibly to its bounty. She had overheard him earlier, declaring his fondness for peaches, and now he moved toward the table, his steps slightly unsteady, but his demeanor jovial. "Time for something sweet to cap the evening," he announced, reaching for a particularly ripe peach, its golden skin glowing under the candelabras. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the other key figures. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the host, stood near the fireplace, her emerald gown catching the light as she conversed with a local magistrate. Her smile was fixed, but her fingers twisted the stem of her champagne flute, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as a sign of suppressed anxiety. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, hovered near the buffet, his anxious glances darting between the guests and his staff. He had been meticulous all evening, ensuring every detail was perfect, yet his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a tray of pastries. Mr. Harold Vance, Langley's rival, remained in his shadowed corner, his lean frame rigid, his eyes locked on Langley with an intensity that bordered on menace. Miss Clara Bell, vibrant in her sapphire dress, was chatting with a young couple near the basket, but her laughter seemed forced, and she cast frequent glances toward Langley. As Langley lifted the peach to his lips, the room's atmosphere seemed to tighten, though only Miss Marple appeared to notice. She held her breath, her instincts prickling with an unnameable dread. Langley took a generous bite, juice dribbling down his chin as he grinned. "Divine?" he proclaimed, raising the fruit as if toasting the room. A few guests chuckled, but the moment was shattered by a sudden, guttural gasp. Langley's face contorted, his eyes widening, in shock. The peach slipped from his hand, rolling across the polished floor, and he clutched his throat, his knees buckling. A collective gasp rose from the guests as he collapsed, his body crumpling onto the Persian rug with a sickening thud. For a heartbeat, the room froze, the quartet's music faltering into silence. Then chaos erupted. Mrs. Grayson let out a stifled cry, her champagne flute slipping to the floor, where it shattered. Clara Bell rushed forward, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears already brimming in her eyes. "Arthur, no," she wailed, dropping to her knees beside him. Reed stood rooted to the spot, his face ashen, while Vance remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving the scene. Miss Marple, her heart pounding but her mind clear, stepped forward, her small frame cutting through the gathering crowd with surprising authority. Dr. Haydock, the local physician and a guest at the party, pushed his way through, his face grim. He knelt beside Langley, pressing fingers to his neck and then his wrist, searching for a pulse. The room held its breath as he worked, his movements swift but precise. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes meeting Mrs. Grayson's. "He's gone," he said quietly. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." A murmur of shock rippled through the guests, some stepping back, others pressing closer. Mrs. Grayson swayed, clutching the arm of the magistrate for support. "Gone?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how? How could this happen?" Clara's sobs grew louder, her hands clutching Langley's lifeless arm as if she could will him back to life. Reed, finally breaking from his stupor, stammered, "It's impossible. My food. It was all perfect." Vance alone remained silent, his face a mask, though Miss Marple noted the faintest tightening of his jaw. Dr. Haydock rose, his expression darkening. "This is no natural death," he said, his voice low but firm. "The symptoms, convulsions, the suddenness, it suggests poison. We must notify the police at once." A fresh wave of gasps met his words, and the guests began to whisper, their eyes darting toward the fruit basket. Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, followed their gazes. The peach, now lying abandoned on the floor, seemed to mock the room's earlier gaiety, its half-eaten flesh a stark reminder of the tragedy. Mrs. Grayson, regaining some composure, raised a trembling hand. "Please, everyone, stay calm. We'll get to the bottom of this. I'll telephone Inspector Crane." She moved toward the hall, her steps unsteady, as a servant hurried to assist her. The guests, now subdued, clustered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the chaos, slipped closer to the fruit basket, her eyes scanning its contents. The peaches, apples, and grapes appeared untouched, their beauty undiminished, yet she sensed they held the key to the night's horror. She recalled the faint, chemical scent she had detected earlier and wondered if it was more than her imagination. Dr. Haydock, now directing two servants to cover Langley's body with a tablecloth, caught Miss Marple's eye. "A bad business, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Cyanide, I'd wager, from the speed of it. But how it got to him?" He trailed off, glancing at the basket. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind racing. Cyanide was not a subtle poison. It required intent, precision, and opportunity. She thought of Reed's earlier insistence that the basket was for display, of Vance's lingering near it, of Clara's proximity, and of Mrs. Grayson's nervous glances. Each had been near the basket at some point. Each had a connection to Langley, and each, she suspected, had secrets yet to be uncovered. The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Crane, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense air. His gray eyes swept the room, taking in the shocked faces, the covered body, and the fruit basket. "Right," he said briskly, addressing the guests. "No one leaves this house until we've sorted this out. Dr. Haydock, your assessment?" The doctor repeated his suspicion of poison, pointing to the peach as the likely source. Crane nodded, his gaze settling on the basket. "We'll have that analyzed immediately, and I'll need statements from everyone, starting with those closest to Mr. Langley." He turned to Mrs. Grayson, who had returned, her face pale but composed. "Mrs. Grayson, as the host, you'll begin. And you," he added, pointing to Reed, "since you provided the food." Reed flinched, his hands twisting in his apron. Crane's eyes then fell on Clara, still kneeling beside Langley, and Vance, who had finally stepped forward, his expression unyielding. "You two as well. Anyone with a connection to the deceased or the basket, step forward." Miss Marple, standing quietly, was not called upon, but she listened intently as the inspector began his questioning, her mind cataloging every word, every gesture. Mrs. Grayson spoke first, her voice steady but strained. Arthur was a distant cousin, a dear man. I invited him to make the evening special. I had no reason to wish him harm. Her eyes flicked toward the basket, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands. Reed, next, was almost incoherent in his panic. "The fruit was fresh, delivered this morning. I checked everything myself. It's not possible, not my fault." His desperation was palpable, but Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed from fear of ruin or something deeper. Clara, tearful, described Langley as a mentor and friend, her voice breaking as she swore she could not imagine who would do such a thing. Vance, last, was curt. "I knew Langley through business. We weren't friends, but I didn't kill him. I was just a guest here." His coldness drew a murmur from the crowd, but he seemed unmoved. As the inspector continued, directing his men to secure the dining room and remove the fruit basket for analysis, Miss Marple retreated to her corner, her thoughts spinning. The tragedy had cast a shadow over the evening, but it had also illuminated the players in this grim drama. Langley's death was no accident. Someone in this room had planned it, had used the fruit basket as a weapon. But who? And why? She recalled Vance's enmity, Reed's nervousness, Clara's emotional display, and Mrs. Grayson's unease. Each was a thread in a tapestry of motive and opportunity, and Miss Marple knew that unraveling it would require patience, observation, and an understanding of the human heart's darker corners. As the guests were ushered into the drawing room to wait, Miss Marple remained by the window, her eyes on the now empty table where the basket had stood. The tragedy had begun, but the truth, she was certain, was only beginning to emerge. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The air in Willow Hall had grown heavy, the earlier gaiety replaced by a pall of suspicion and dread. The dining room, now a crime scene, was cordoned off by Inspector Crane's men, their boots echoing on the polished floor as they secured the area. The fruit basket, once the evening's pride, had been whisked away for analysis, its absence leaving a stark void on the linen-draped table. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, where the guests had been herded, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her wool, but her keen eyes missed nothing, and her mind was already piecing together the fragments of the tragedy that had unfolded. Inspector Crane stood at the center of the room, his broad shoulders squared, his gray eyes scanning the assembled guests with the precision of a hawk. His notebook lay open on a side table, its pages already filled with hasty scrawls. "We're dealing with a murder," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Poison, likely cyanide, delivered through that peach. Until we know more, everyone here is a witness, and potentially a suspect. I'll be speaking to each of you in turn, starting with those closest to Mr. Langley." His gaze settled on the four figures. Miss Marple had been watching all evening. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, Mr. Thomas Reed, Mr. Harold Vance, and Miss Clara Bell. Mrs. Grayson, seated on a brocade sofa, clutched a handkerchief, her face pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. "This is a nightmare," she said, her voice trembling as she addressed the inspector. "Arthur was family, a distant cousin, but dear to me. I invited him to bring some cheer to the evening. Why would anyone do this?" Her eyes, wide with distress, darted toward the dining room door, as if expecting Langley to walk through it. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the genuine shock in Mrs. Grayson's posture, but also the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief, a sign of nerves that might conceal more than grief. Inspector Crane scribbled a note, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Grayson, you arranged this event. Did you oversee the food preparation, particularly the fruit basket?" She shook her head, her auburn chignon wobbling slightly. "No, that was Mr. Reed's domain. I trusted him to handle everything. The basket was his idea. A grand centerpiece," he said. Her voice faltered, and she glanced at Reed, who stood near the fireplace, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Reed stepped forward, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his apron, which he had not yet removed. "Inspector, I swear everything I served was perfect," he said, his voice high and strained. "The fruit came from a reputable supplier, Mr. Dawson in the village. I checked every piece myself this morning. Apples, pears, peaches, grapes, all fresh. I arranged the basket personally, and it was locked in the pantry until just before the guests arrived." His eyes darted to the other guests, as if seeking an ally, but found only wary glances. Miss Marple tilted her head, noting his defensiveness. A man so eager to proclaim his innocence often had something to protect, she thought, whether it was his reputation or something more sinister. Crane's pen paused. "Locked, you say? Who had access to the pantry?" Reed hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Just me and my assistant, Sarah, but she was busy with the pastries all day. I brought the basket out myself at 6 o'clock, and it was under my watch until the party began." His voice wavered, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. An hour, perhaps more, when the basket was in the dining room, unattended except by Reed's periodic checks. Plenty of time, she mused, for someone with intent to tamper. The inspector turned to Miss Clara Bell, who sat on a velvet ottoman, her sapphire dress now crumpled, her face streaked with tears. "Miss Bell, you were close to Mr. Langley. Tell me about your relationship." Clara's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt, her voice soft but clear. "Arthur was my friend, my mentor. He helped me through a difficult time, gave me advice, support. He was kind, generous. No one could want him dead." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. The room's attention shifted to her, some guests nodding sympathetically, others exchanging skeptical glances. Miss Marple, however, noted the theatrical quality of Clara's grief. Genuine, perhaps, but also calculated, as if she knew the power of her tears. And Clara had been near the basket, chatting animatedly, her fingers brushing the table's edge. Finally, Crane's gaze fell on Mr. Harold Vance, who stood apart, his lean frame rigid, his dark suit blending into the shadows. "Mr. Vance, I understand you and Mr. Langley were rivals. Care to explain?" Vance's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Rivals? Yes. But that's business, Inspector. Langley outbid me on a contract last month, cost me a tidy sum. But I don't settle scores with poison. I was here as Mrs. Grayson's guest, nothing more." His voice was cool, almost defiant, and Miss Marple detected a faint challenge in his tone, as if daring the inspector to prove otherwise. She recalled his earlier hover near the basket, his hand pausing over the grapes, and wondered what he had been contemplating. Crane closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll have more questions, but for now, no one leaves Willow Hall without my permission. My men will collect statements from the other guests, and the fruit basket is being analyzed as we speak." He nodded to a constable, who began ushering the lesser guests to a side room for interviews. Mrs. Grayson rose, offering to arrange tea for the shaken company, while Reed muttered about checking on his staff. Clara remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor, and Vance retreated to his corner, his expression inscrutable. Miss Marple, unnoticed amidst the bustle, continued her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the room's tension. Her mind was alive with details. The peach singled out from the basket, the chemical scent she had detected, the suspect's reactions. Mrs. Grayson's distress seemed rooted in more than hosting a tragic event, perhaps a fear of what might be uncovered. Reed's panic suggested a man whose livelihood hung in the balance, but was it guilt or merely professional pride? Clara's tears were compelling, yet her proximity to Langley and the basket raised questions. And Vance, with his cold detachment and motive born of financial loss, was a figure of quiet menace. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the basket itself. Why had only Langley been affected? Had the poison been targeted, or was it a reckless act that claimed him by chance? She glanced at Dr. Haydock, who was conferring with Crane near the dining room door. The doctor caught her eye and approached, his face grave. "A nasty business, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Cyanide, I'm certain, from the symptoms. Bitter, almond-like smell, rapid collapse. It's not something you stumble into by accident. Someone meant to kill." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Indeed, doctor, and the peach, such a deliberate choice. Mr. Langley was fond of them, wasn't he?" Haydock frowned, considering. "Yes, he mentioned it once at a dinner I attended. Always chose peaches for dessert. Whoever did this might have known that." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on this detail. A targeted poison required knowledge of the victim's habits, narrowing the field of suspects to those who knew Langley well. She thought of Vance's business dealings, where such preferences might have been noted over shared meals. Clara, too, as Langley's confidant, would likely know his tastes. Reed, responsible for the basket, had the means to tamper, and Mrs. Grayson, as host, could have orchestrated the display to conceal a darker purpose. Each had opportunity, but motive remained elusive. As the guests murmured among themselves, Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she moved toward the window. The night outside was dark, the stars obscured by clouds, mirroring the mystery within. She thought of her garden at home, where a single weed could choke a rose if left unchecked. This crime, she sensed, was such a weed, its roots hidden but spreading. The investigation had begun, but it was her quiet observation, her understanding of the small betrayals of human nature that would uncover the truth. She resumed her knitting, her eyes flicking to the suspects, each a thread in the tapestry she was determined to unravel. Chapter 5. The Fruit Basket. The drawing room of Willow Hall, though still aglow with the soft light of chandeliers, had taken on a somber air, as if the very walls mourned the tragedy that had unfolded. The guests, now confined to this elegant prison, whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the sealed dining room, where Mr. Arthur Langley's body lay beneath a tablecloth, a grim reminder of the evening's turn. Miss Jane Marple sat in her unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision, though her mind was far from the pale blue scarf taking shape in her hands. She was piecing together the puzzle of the poisoned peach, and her thoughts kept returning to the fruit basket, that lavish centerpiece now under police scrutiny. Inspector Crane had retreated to the dining room with Dr. Haydock and a constable, their voices a low murmur behind the closed doors. The fruit basket, whisked away for analysis, was the key to the mystery. Miss Marple was certain. Its prominence, its allure, and the fact that only Langley had been struck down suggested a crime of chilling precision. She recalled the moment Langley had reached for the peach, his jovial declaration echoing in the room, and the swift, horrific consequence. Why that peach? Why only him? The questions circled in her mind, each one a thread she longed to tug. With the guests distracted, Miss Marple rose, her small frame moving with quiet purpose toward the dining room door. Inspector Crane, emerging just then, caught sight of her and raised an eyebrow. "Miss Marple, this is a crime scene. I must ask you to stay with the others." His tone was firm, but not unkind, for he knew the elderly spinster's reputation for noticing what others missed. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with disarming innocence. "Of course, Inspector. I only wish to ask if I might have a closer look at where the basket stood. Sometimes the smallest detail can be illuminating." Crane hesitated, then nodded, perhaps sensing that her request was not idle curiosity. "Very well, but stay clear of the evidence. My men are still working." He held the door open, and Miss Marple stepped into the dining room, her gaze immediately drawn to the empty table where the basket had been. The candelabras still burned, casting long shadows across the linen cloth, now marked by a faint stain where the peach had rolled. The room felt colder, the absence of the basket's vibrant colors stark against the polished wood and crystal. Dr. Haydock, standing near the table, looked up as she entered. "Miss Marple, you're not one to sit idly by, are you?" he said, a wry smile softening his grave expression. "The basket's gone to the laboratory, but I can tell you the poison was cyanide, fast-acting, likely applied to the peach's skin. The smell was faint, but unmistakable to a trained nose." Miss Marple nodded, her memory stirring. She had detected that sharp, chemical scent near the basket earlier, though she had dismissed it as imagination at the time. Now, it seemed a vital clue. "Only the peach, Doctor?" she asked, her voice mild but probing. "No other fruit showed signs?" Haydock shook his head. "Not that we could tell from a cursory look. The lab will confirm, but Langley's symptoms were immediate, consistent with a single, tainted piece. Whoever did this knew what they were about." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the table, picturing the basket as it had been, the peaches arranged in a tempting cluster, the grapes cascading over the edge, the apples and pears a perfect backdrop. She recalled Langley's choice, how he had singled out a peach from a specific section near the grapes. Had that been deliberate or mere chance? She stepped closer to the table, her fingers brushing the linen as she visualized the basket's layout. "The grapes," she said softly, almost to herself. "They were near the peaches, weren't they?" Almost touching. Haydock frowned, puzzled. "Yes, I suppose so. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, her mind racing. The grapes had caught her eye earlier, their glossy sheen seeming almost too perfect, and she wondered if they held a clue to the poison's application. Had someone brushed a substance across both fruits, knowing Langley's preference would guide his hand? Inspector Crane, rejoining them, overheard her remark. "Miss Marple, if you've a theory, I'd like to hear it. We're waiting on the lab, but anything you've noticed could help." His tone was brisk, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "Only an observation, Inspector. The basket was so beautifully arranged, yet only one fruit was poisoned. It suggests someone who knew Mr. Langley's habits, his love of peaches, perhaps, and who had access to the basket before it was served." Crane's eyes narrowed. "Access. That points to Mr. Reed, the caterer, or someone in the kitchen." He glanced at the door, where a constable stood guard. But Mrs. Grayson, Miss Bell, and Mr. Vance were all near the basket during the evening. Any of them could have tampered with it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning with his. She recalled Reed's nervous hovering, his insistence that the basket was for display, Mrs. Grayson's anxious glances, Clara's proximity, her fingers grazing the table, and Vance's brief pause near the grapes. Each had opportunity, but the motive remained elusive. She turned to Doctor. "Hey, Doc. Doctor, you mentioned the poison was likely on the skin. Could it have been applied with precision? A brush, perhaps, or a cloth?" Haydock considered this, his brow furrowing. "Possible, yes. Cyanide can be mixed into a solution, applied thinly to avoid detection. It would take a steady hand, but it's feasible." Miss Marple's mind seized on this, picturing a careful hand dabbing poison onto a single peach, perhaps under the guise of adjusting the basket's arrangement. Such an act required not only nerve, but also knowledge of the victim's preferences. As Crane and Haydock continued their discussion, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the floor, where a faint gleam caught her eye. She bent down, her movements slow but deliberate, and picked up a small, crumpled leaf that had fallen from the basket. It was from a grapevine, its edge slightly discolored, as if touched by something unnatural. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her face betraying nothing. "A small thing," she murmured, "but gardens often hide their secrets in the smallest details." Crane, distracted by a constable's report, did not hear, but Haydock gave her a curious look. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking once more. The guests were restless, their earlier shock giving way to unease as they realized the investigation would not end quickly. Mrs. Grayson sat stiffly, her eyes red-rimmed but her composure intact. Reed paced near the fireplace, muttering about his ruined reputation. Clara, her tears dried, stared out a window, her expression unreadable. Vance, as ever, stood apart, his dark eyes scanning the room with a predator's calm. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind weaving connections. The leaf in her handkerchief was a new piece of the puzzle, suggesting the poison might have touched more than just the peach. Had the grapes been a decoy, or an unintended residue of the killer's work? She thought of Langley's jovial certainty as he chose the peach, his habit well known to those who dined with him. Vance, with his business rivalry, would have shared meals with Langley, perhaps noting his preferences. Clara, as his confidant, would know them too. Reed, responsible for the basket, had the easiest access, and Mrs. Grayson, as host, could have orchestrated the entire display. Each was a suspect, each a thread in the intricate web of motive and opportunity. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough from Dr. Haydock, who had joined her. "You're deep in thought, Miss Marple," he said, his tone light but probing. "Found something in that leaf, have you?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Only a possibility, Doctor. People are like gardens, you know, full of hidden corners. It's the small things, the overlooked things, that often tell the tale. Haydock chuckled, but his expression was thoughtful as he returned to Crane. As the night deepened, the guests grew silent, the weight of suspicion settling over them like a fog. Miss Marple, her knitting a quiet rhythm in the stillness, knew the fruit basket held the key to Langley's death. Its beauty had been a mask, concealing a deadly intent. She would wait, observe, and listen. For the truth, she was certain, would reveal itself in the smallest of details, perhaps in a leaf, a glance, or a word spoken too quickly. Chapter 6. The Business Feud. The drawing room of Willow Hall, though still elegant with its gilded mirrors and velvet drapes, had become a cage of whispered suspicions and strained silences. The guests, confined by Inspector Crane's orders, shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier conviviality replaced by the grim reality of murder. Miss Jane Marple sat near a rosewood table, her knitting needles clicking softly, a picture of serene detachment. Yet her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, missed nothing. The crumpled grapevine leaf in her handkerchief weighed on her mind, a small but nagging clue that hinted at the precision of the crime. Her thoughts, however, were now turning to the undercurrents of motive, and one thread stood out: the bitter rivalry between Mr. Arthur Langley and Mr. Harold Vance. The morning after the tragedy, St. Mary Mead buzzed with gossip, as it always did when scandal struck. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage for a few hours of rest, ventured out to the village tea shop, a modest establishment run by Mrs. Bantry's cousin, Miss Eliza. The shop was a hub of local chatter, where secrets were traded as freely as scones. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, settled into a corner table with a pot of Earl Grey, her ears attuned to the conversations around her. The air was thick with speculation about Langley's death, and the name Harold Vance surfaced repeatedly, each mention laced with intrigue. Mrs. Bantry herself, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatic storytelling, joined Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. "Jane, it's dreadful, simply dreadful," she began, her voice carrying just enough to draw curious glances from nearby tables. "Everyone's talking about Vance, you know. He and Langley were at daggers drawn over that contract with the railway company. Langley swooped in at the last moment, undercutting Vance's bid with some clever maneuver. Left Vance's firm in quite a pickle, they say. Debts piling up, clients deserting. I heard he threatened Langley at a club in London, said he'd make him pay." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you think he could have done it, Jane? Poisoned that peach out of spite?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression placid but her mind racing. "People do act rashly when their pride is wounded, Dolly," she said softly. "But Mr. Vance struck me as a man of control, not impulse. Threats are one thing, murder is quite another." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her saucer. "Still, it's curious that he was invited to Willow Hall, don't you think? Mrs. Grayson must have known of their enmity." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously, her hat bobbing. "Oh, Eleanor's no fool. She's got a knack for stirring the pot, that one. Perhaps she wanted to see sparks fly." The conversation turned to other matters, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Vance. His demeanor at the party had been striking, aloof, watchful, his dark eyes fixed on Langley with an intensity that suggested more than casual dislike. Yet his restraint, his refusal to engage beyond the barest civility, hinted at a calculating mind. She recalled his brief pause near the fruit basket, his hand hovering over the grapes before withdrawing. Was it a moment of temptation, or had he already acted? The leaf she had found, with its faint discoloration, suggested the poison might have brushed against more than just the peach. Vance, with his business dealings, would have had opportunities to observe Langley's habits, perhaps noting his preference for peaches over countless shared dinners. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple strolled toward the village green, her steps slow but purposeful. She passed the post office, where a cluster of locals whispered about the murder, their voices hushed but eager. "Vance was furious, I heard," said young Tom, the grocer's boy. "Said Langley ruined him. Wouldn't surprise me if he slipped something in that fruit." His companion, an elderly woman with a basket of apples, shook her head. "But to kill in front of everyone takes a bold sort, or a desperate one." Miss Marple filed these snippets away, each a piece of the mosaic she was assembling. Back at Willow Hall, where Inspector Crane had summoned the key suspects for further questioning, Miss Marple was permitted to observe, her presence tolerated as that of a harmless old lady with a knack for insight. The dining room, now stripped of its festive trappings, felt stark, the empty table a silent witness to the crime. Crane stood by the window, his notebook open as he addressed Vance, who sat with his arms crossed, his lean face impassive. "Mr. Vance," Crane began, his voice clipped, "your rivalry with Mr. Langley is no secret. You lost a significant contract to him, one that threatened your business. Care to explain why you were at this party, given your history?" Vance's lips curled into a faint, sardonic smile. "Mrs. Grayson invited me, Inspector. I assumed it was a gesture of civility, perhaps to mend fences. I had no intention of causing a scene." His tone was smooth, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words. He was not denying his anger, only his actions. Crane pressed further. "You were seen near the fruit basket before Langley took the peach. Did you touch anything?" Vance's eyes flickered, but his voice remained steady. "I admired the display, nothing more. I'm not in the habit of fondling fruit." A few guests stifled nervous laughs, but Miss Marple's attention was on Vance's hands, which remained still, betraying no nervous tics. A man so composed, she thought, either had nothing to hide or everything to conceal. As Crane moved on to question Mrs. Grayson, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the nature of the feud. Langley's triumph had been no mere business deal. It had humiliated Vance, stripping him of clients and credibility. In St. Mary Mead, where reputations were currency, such a loss could drive a man to desperation. Yet poison required planning, not passion, a cold, deliberate act. She considered Vance's background, gleaned from village gossip, a self-made man, meticulous, with a reputation for ruthlessness in negotiations. Could that ruthlessness extend to murder? And if so, how had he ensured only Langley would take the poisoned peach? Mrs. Grayson, now answering Crane's questions, seemed more composed than the previous night, though her hands still clutched her handkerchief. "I invited Mr. Vance because I believe in second chances," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes avoiding Vance's. "I thought a neutral setting might ease tensions. I had no idea it would end like this." Miss Marple, watching closely, sensed a half-truth. Mrs. Grayson's invitation might have been strategic, perhaps to curry favor with both men or to deflect attention from her own troubles. The widow's financial situation, rumored to be precarious, suggested she had much to gain from Langley's goodwill and much to lose from his death. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple slipped away to the garden, where the morning light revealed the manicured lawns of Willow Hall. She paused by a grapevine trellis, its leaves similar to the one in her handkerchief. Bending down, she examined the foliage, noting a faint, oily residue on a few leaves, barely visible. It was not proof, but it strengthened her suspicion that the poison had been applied with care, perhaps with a cloth or brush, and that the grapes had been inadvertently touched. Vance's presence near the basket loomed larger in her mind, but she cautioned herself against haste. Clara's tears, Reed's panic, and Mrs. Grayson's unease were equally compelling threads, each demanding scrutiny. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes scanning the suspects. Vance's calm was a facade, she decided, but one that might crack under pressure. The business feud was a powerful motive, but the method, poison in a public setting, suggested a mind that calculated risks with precision. As Crane dismissed the group, promising further interviews, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away, her thoughts already turning to the next step. The truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of motive and opportunity, and she would follow each thread until the tapestry of the crime was complete. Chapter 7. The Caterer's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Willow Hall, casting long, slanting rays across the drawing room, where the air still held the weight of the previous night's tragedy. The guests had dispersed, allowed to return to their homes, under strict instructions from Inspector Crane to remain available for questioning. Miss Jane Marple, however, lingered in St. Mary Mead, her curiosity as sharp as the knitting needles now tucked into her bag. She had returned to her cottage briefly, but the puzzle of the poisoned peach drew her back to the village, where she sought out Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer whose anxious demeanor at the party had not escaped her notice. The village was abuzz with speculation, its narrow lanes alive with whispers about the murder at Willow Hall. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, made her way to Reed's small shop, a quaint establishment tucked between the butcher and the haberdashery. The sign above the door read, "Reed's Fine Catering," its gold lettering slightly faded but proud. Inside, the shop was quiet, the usual bustle of customers absent, no doubt due to the scandal. Reed stood behind the counter, polishing a silver tray with a fervor that suggested he was scrubbing away more than tarnish. His wiry frame was tense, his dark hair disheveled, and his eyes darted toward the door as the bell chimed to announce Miss Marple's arrival. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice gentle but with a hint of purpose. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought you might be feeling the strain of last night's events." Reed's hand paused mid-polish, and he looked up, his expression a mix of exhaustion and wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Kind of you to call. It's been a dreadful shock, hasn't it? My reputation, my business, it's all I've worked for, and now this." He trailed off, his hands resuming their restless motion. Miss Marple settled into a chair near the counter, her small frame radiating a quiet authority. "A dreadful business indeed," she agreed, her eyes scanning the shop's tidy shelves, where jars of preserves and neatly stacked linens spoke of Reed's meticulous nature. The fruit basket was quite the centerpiece, wasn't it? Such a beautiful arrangement. You must have taken great care with it. Her tone was conversational, but her words were chosen with care, probing for a reaction. Reed's shoulders stiffened, and he set the tray down with a clatter. "I did," he said, his voice tight. "I chose every piece myself, apples, pears, peaches, grapes, all from Dawson's, the best supplier in the county. I spent hours arranging it, making sure it was perfect for Mrs. Grayson's party. It was meant to be the talk of the evening. And now?" He shook his head, his hands twisting in the cloth. "Now it's the talk for all the wrong reasons." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "It must be terribly upsetting, Mr. Reed, to have your work so cruelly misused. You said the basket was locked in the pantry until 6 o'clock. Was it truly secure? No one could have tampered with it." Reed's eyes flickered, and he hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. I kept it locked, yes. Only I had the key. My assistant, Sarah, was busy with other preparations, and no one else went near it. I brought it out myself and placed it on the table. It was under my watch until the guests arrived." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice, the way his fingers clutched the cloth as if anchoring himself. An hour, she thought, between the basket leaving the pantry and the party's start. An hour when it stood in the dining room, vulnerable to a quick hand. "And during that time," she said gently, "did you ever leave the room, even for a moment?" Reed's flush deepened, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on a jar of quince jelly. "Well, I had to check on the kitchen, didn't I? The pheasant, the pastries, everything needed attention, but it was only for a few minutes here and there. No one could have done anything without me noticing." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind cataloging his unease. A few minutes here and there was more than enough for someone with intent. She recalled Reed's anxious hovering at the party, his quick intervention when a guest reached for the basket, his insistence that it was for display. Was he protecting his creation or covering a mistake? Or worse, a deliberate act? "You mentioned Mr. Dawson's fruit," she said, shifting tack. "A reliable man, I'm sure. Did you inspect each piece closely, or was there perhaps a rush with so much to prepare?" Reed's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flash of something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "I checked everything," he said quickly. "Every apple, every peach. I'd stake my name on it. If there was poison, it wasn't there when I arranged the basket." His voice rose, and he caught himself lowering it with effort. "Someone must have got to it later, Miss Marple. Someone at the party." His words hung in the air, a desperate plea for belief. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, tracing the possibilities of that unattended hour. As she thanked Reed and prepared to leave, a memory surfaced from the party. Mr. Harold Vance, Langley's rival, had been seen near the kitchen door, ostensibly to compliment the food. Had he slipped inside during one of Reed's absences? She thought of Mrs. Grayson's nervous glances, Clara Bell's proximity to the basket, and now Reed's defensive agitation. Each had been near the basket, each had a connection to Langley, and each, she suspected, held secrets that the light of inquiry would soon reveal. Stepping out into the crisp autumn air, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the village green, her mind sifting through Reed's words. His panic was genuine, but whether it stemmed from professional ruin or something deeper, she could not yet say. The leaf in her handkerchief, with its faint, oily residue, suggested the poison had been applied with care, perhaps by someone familiar with the basket's arrangement. Reed, as the caterer, had the easiest access, but his ambition, his dream of expanding his business, relied on patrons like Mrs. Grayson and Langley. Would he risk it all for murder? Or had he been an unwitting pawn, his basket used by another's hand? She paused by the churchyard, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, was tending a flower bed. "Terrible about Mr. Langley, isn't it?" Mrs. Price said, straightening up, her hands dusted with soil. "Poor Mr. Reed's beside himself. He was counting on that party to make his name, and now folks are saying he's to blame." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "A pity indeed, but people often see what's on the surface, Mrs. Price. The truth lies deeper, in the roots." Mrs. Price looked puzzled, but Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere, picturing the basket, the peach, and the moment of Langley's fatal choice. As she made her way home, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Vance's cold resentment, Clara's calculated tears, Mrs. Grayson's strained composure. All were pieces of a puzzle that centered on the basket. Reed's tale had added a new layer, but it also raised questions. If the basket had been tampered with after leaving the pantry, who had seized that fleeting opportunity? And why had Reed been so quick to deflect blame? She thought of her own garden, where a single pest could ruin a crop if left unchecked. This crime, she sensed, was such a pest, and she would need to dig carefully to uncover its source. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The caterer's tale was one of pride and panic, but it was not the whole story. The truth, she was certain, lay in the small details: the unattended hour, the discolored leaf, the peach chosen with such deadly precision. As the afternoon light faded, she resolved to watch and listen, for the next thread in this intricate tapestry was waiting to be found. Chapter 8. Clara's Secret. The soft light of late morning filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her sitting room. The village of St. Mary Mead was quieter now, the initial frenzy of gossip about Mr. Arthur Langley's murder settling into a persistent hum of speculation. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles idle for once. Her thoughts were fixed on Miss Clara Bell, the young woman whose tearful display at Willow Hall had drawn both sympathy and suspicion. Clara's connection to Langley, described as that of a mentor and friend, intrigued Miss Marple, for she had seen many such friendships conceal deeper ties, obligations, debts, or secrets that could turn deadly. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple had invited Clara for tea, a gentle pretext to probe the young woman's story. The invitation was accepted with a mixture of eagerness and hesitation, suggesting Clara was both anxious to clear her name and wary of scrutiny. As the clock struck 11, a soft knock announced Clara's arrival. Miss Marple opened the door to find her dressed in a simple navy frock, a far cry from the vibrant sapphire gown of the party. Her golden curls were pinned neatly, but her eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed, betrayed a sleepless night. "Miss Marple, it's so kind of you to ask me," Clara said, her voice soft but tinged with strain. I don't know how to go on after what happened." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but her eyes sharp. "A cup of tea can do wonders, even in the darkest times." She led Clara to the sitting room, where a tray of scones and a steaming teapot awaited. As they settled, Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, giving Clara time to relax. or to betray her nerves. The young woman's hands fidgeted with her gloves, a small gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. People, she knew, often revealed their truths in such unguarded moments. They spoke of trivialities at first, the weather, the village's autumn fair, but Miss Marple soon steered the conversation toward Langley. "He was a great help to you, I understand," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "A mentor, you said. It must be a terrible loss." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, clutching her teacup. "He was more than a mentor, Miss Marple. Arthur was a lifeline. I was in a bad way a year ago. Debts, you see, from some foolish investments. My father left me little, and I was desperate. Arthur lent me a large sum, no questions asked, and guided me through it. He believed in me, said I had a head for business if I'd only learned discipline." Her voice broke, and she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple listened, her expression sympathetic, but her mind alert. A debt, especially a large one, was a powerful motive, particularly if repayment was difficult. "That was generous of him," she said, sipping her tea. "And were you able to repay him? Such kindness must have weighed heavily." Clara's fingers tightened on the handkerchief, and she hesitated, a flush creeping up her cheeks. I was trying to. I'd started a small venture, selling embroidered linens, and it was doing well. But I hadn't paid him back yet, not fully. He never pressed me, though. He was so kind." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple detected a note of defensiveness, as if Clara feared the implication of her debt. The old lady tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. "It must have been a comfort, having such a friend. You were close to him at the party, weren't you? I recall you standing near the fruit basket, chatting so brightly." Clara's flush deepened, and she set her teacup down with a faint clink. "I suppose I was. Arthur liked my company. He said I cheered him up. I didn't think anything of the basket, honestly. It was just there." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the window, avoiding her gaze. Clara had been near the basket, her fingers brushing the table's edge, and Miss Marple wondered if that proximity was as innocent as she claimed. The conversation turned to the party, and Clara described her shock at Langley's collapse, her tears flowing freely as she recounted kneeling beside him. "I couldn't believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "One moment he was laughing, eating that peach, and then it was so sudden." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the basket, the poisoned peach, and the discolored leaf she had found. Clara's grief seemed genuine, but there was a theatrical quality to it, a performance honed by practice. Miss Marple had known many young women like Clara, charming, ambitious, and sometimes desperate, and she sensed a story beneath the surface. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "Did Mr. Langley ever mention his business dealings? Any troubles, perhaps, with rivals or friends?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief into a knot. "He didn't talk much about that with me. He liked to keep things light, you know. But I heard him argue with Mr. Vance once, at a dinner in London. It was about that railway contract. Arthur laughed it off, but Mr. Vance was furious. I didn't think it meant anything serious." Her words came quickly, as if she regretted mentioning it, and Miss Marple filed away this tidbit, noting Clara's attempt to shift suspicion. As the tea grew cold, Miss Marple gently probed further, asking about Clara's life, her plans, her hopes. Each question was a delicate thread, drawing out more of Clara's story. She admitted to struggling financially, even with Langley's loan, and her embroidery venture was still fledgling, reliant on the goodwill of wealthy patrons like Mrs. Grayson. "I wanted to make Arthur proud," she said, her eyes glistening. "Now he's gone, and people are looking at me as if I had something to do with it." Her voice rose, a note of indignation breaking through, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch calming but her mind alert. The visit ended with Clara promising to call again, her gratitude tinged with unease. As Miss Marple saw her to the door, she noticed a small embroidery needle tucked into Clara's glove, a detail that might have been insignificant but struck her as curious. Needles, after all, were precise tools, much like the method used to poison the peach. Alone again, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her thoughts circling Clara's story. The debt was a compelling motive. Unpaid, it could have bred resentment or fear, especially if Langley had begun to press for repayment. Clara's proximity to the basket, her knowledge of Langley's habits, and her emotional display all pointed to a young woman caught in a web of her own making. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea shop. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was there, sorting letters with a knowing air. "Poor Clara Bell," she said, catching Miss Marple's eye. "She's been crying her eyes out, saying she'll never recover from Mr. Langley's death. But I heard she owed him a fortune. Thousands, they say. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "People do get tangled in their own nets, Mrs. Clement, but it's the quiet threads that often hold the truth." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes on the garden where roses bloomed despite the autumn chill. Clara's secret, the debt, the desperation, added a new layer to the mystery. She thought of the basket, the poisoned peach, and the leaf with its faint residue. Clara's tears, Reed's panic, Vance's coldness, and Mrs. Grayson's unease were all pieces of a puzzle, each with its own motive and opportunity. Clara's story had revealed a vulnerability, but also a cunning that Miss Marple could not ignore. As the light faded, she resolved to watch closely, for the truth, she knew, was often hidden in the smallest gestures, a needle, a glance, or a debt unpaid. Chapter 9. The Host's Burden. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow that belied the shadow of murder lingering over Willow Hall. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat buttoned against the autumn chill, walked the winding path to the manor, her mind as active as her steps were measured. The investigation into Mr. Arthur Langley's death had stirred the village into a frenzy of whispers, but Miss Marple's thoughts were focused on Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the enigmatic host whose elegant party had ended in tragedy. Her nervous glances, her strained composure, and her connection to Langley as a distant cousin suggested a burden beyond mere hospitality, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover its nature. Mrs. Grayson had extended an invitation for Miss Marple to call at Willow Hall, a gesture framed as a desire for comfort in the wake of the disaster, but which Miss Marple suspected held deeper motives. As she approached the manor's iron gates, the grandeur of the Georgian facade seemed diminished, its honey-colored stone dulled by the weight of recent events. A maid ushered her into the drawing room, where Mrs. Grayson sat by a crackling fire, her auburn hair neatly pinned but her face pale, the lines of strain more pronounced than at the party. She rose, her emerald shawl slipping slightly, and offered a tremulous smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice soft but edged with fatigue. "I'm at my wit's end, truly. This dreadful business, it's more than I can bear." Miss Marple settled into a plush armchair, her small frame dwarfed by its grandeur, but her presence commanding in its quiet way. "It's a terrible shock, Mrs. Grayson," she said, her tone soothing yet deliberate. "To have such a tragedy unfold under your roof, it must weigh heavily." She paused, her eyes meeting Mrs. Grayson's, noting the flicker of unease that passed through them. "But you were so composed at the party, managing everything with such grace. It's a wonder you found the strength." Mrs. Grayson's hands twisted in her lap, clutching a lace handkerchief that bore signs of frequent use. "I had to be strong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my party, my responsibility. Arthur was family, you know, a cousin, distant but dear. I wanted the evening to be perfect, to show St. Mary Mead that Willow Hall could be a place of joy again." Her eyes drifted to the fireplace, where flames danced over logs, and Miss Marple sensed a carefully curated story, one that invited sympathy but perhaps concealed more. They spoke for a time of the party's planning, Mrs. Grayson describing her vision for the harvest celebration and her reliance on Mr. Reed's catering. "The fruit basket was his idea," she said, echoing Reed's own account. "He insisted it would be the centerpiece, a symbol of abundance. I trusted him to handle it. I had so much else to manage." Her voice faltered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, as if to steady herself. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the basket's prominence, the poisoned peach, and the faint, oily residue on the grapevine leaf she had tucked away. "A beautiful display," she said gently. "Did you happen to see it before it was brought out? Or perhaps notice anyone lingering near it during the party?" Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened briefly, and she shook her head. "I was too busy greeting guests, ensuring everything ran smoothly. I saw Mr. Reed arranging it earlier, but after that I hardly had a moment to spare." Her words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, a sign of nerves that belied her calm facade. The old lady's thoughts turned to the rumors she had heard at the village tea shop. Mrs. Grayson's finances were strained, her late husband's, wealth diminished by poor investments. Langley, a successful businessman, had reportedly been an investor in her estate, a lifeline to maintain Willow Hall's grandeur. His death, Miss Marple mused, could threaten that stability, or perhaps resolve it in some darker way. "Mr. Langley was a great support to you. I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as a breeze, but her eyes sharp. "A cousin, but also an investor, perhaps. It must have been a comfort to have his backing." Mrs. Grayson's hands stilled, and for a moment her composure wavered, a flush creeping up her neck. "He was generous," she admitted, her voice low. "Willow Hall is costly to maintain, and Arthur helped me keep it afloat. He believed in its legacy, you see. But now, with him gone—" She trailed off, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell. Miss Marple watched closely, sensing a truth half-spoken. A financial dependence on Langley could breed gratitude or resentment if it came with strings. The conversation shifted to the other suspects, and Mrs. Grayson spoke carefully, as if weighing each word. "Mr. Vance was a risk, I suppose, inviting him with Arthur," she said, her tone regretful. "But I thought a public setting might ease their rivalry, and Clara, such a sweet girl, so devoted to Arthur. I can't imagine her involved in anything so dreadful." Her voice was earnest, but Miss Marple detected a hint of deflection, as if Mrs. Grayson were eager to point suspicion elsewhere. Reed, she said, had been impeccable in his service, though she admitted his ambition made him perhaps too eager to please. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a small writing desk in the corner, where a stack of letters peeked from beneath a blotter. One envelope bore a crest similar to the one on the party invitation, suggesting correspondence with someone of means, perhaps Langley himself. "You must have been in close contact with Mr. Langley, planning the party," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Did he ever mention any worries? Any enemies?" Mrs. Grayson shook her head, but her hands tightened on the handkerchief, and Miss Marple sensed a reluctance to delve deeper. "He was always cheerful with me," she said. "If he had enemies, he kept them from me." The visit drew to a close, and Mrs. Grayson rose, her shawl slipping further as she escorted Miss Marple to the door. "You've been a comfort, Miss Marple," she said, her smile strained. "I only hope this nightmare ends soon." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, but her mind racing. Mrs. Grayson's burden, financial strain, dependence on Langley, and the pressure of hosting a perfect event painted her as a woman with much to lose. Had she orchestrated the basket's role to deflect suspicion, or was she a victim of another's cunning? As Miss Marple walked back to the village, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot, she pondered the host's story. The leaf in her handkerchief, the poisoned peach, and the precise nature of the crime pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of Langley's habits. Mrs. Grayson, as host, had controlled the evening stage, choosing the guests and the setting. Her nervous glances at the basket suggested she knew more than she admitted, but whether as perpetrator or bystander, Miss Marple could not yet say. She thought of her garden, where a single frost could ruin a bloom if not anticipated. Mrs. Grayson's burden, she sensed, was such a frost, and its chill might yet reveal the truth. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the window, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the wool. The host's story had added a new thread to the tapestry of the crime, one woven with financial desperation and familial ties. Clara's debt, Reed's ambition, Vance's rivalry, and now Mrs. Grayson's dependence, all were motives circling the fatal peach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple resolved to keep watching, for the truth, she knew, would emerge in the quiet spaces where secrets could no longer hide. Chapter 10. The Clue in the Grapes. The soft glow of dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and shadow, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles still for once. The events at Willow Hall, now 3 days past, had cast a long shadow, and the mystery of Mr. Arthur Langley's murder remained unresolved. Inspector Crane's investigation was methodical, but Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the overlooked details, the small threads that others dismissed. Her mind kept returning to the fruit basket, its poisoned peach, and the discolored grapevine leaf tucked in her handkerchief, a clue that whispered of precision and intent. Today, she resolved to examine the basket itself, or what remained of it, to uncover the secret it held. With Inspector Crane's permission, Miss Marple returned to Willow Hall, where the dining room had been cleared of its festive trappings, leaving only a stark table and the lingering scent of wax from extinguished candles. The fruit basket, now in police custody, had been analyzed, and Crane had agreed to let her inspect it under supervision, perhaps sensing her knack for seeing what others missed. As she entered the room, accompanied by a young constable, the basket sat on a side table, its contents carefully preserved in evidence bags, but reassembled for her perusal. The apples, pears, and grapes remained vibrant, though the peaches, including the fatal one, had been taken for further testing. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the grapes, their glossy sheen still striking, and she recalled the faint, oily residue on the leaf she had found. "Thank you, Constable," she said, her voice mild as she donned a pair of gloves provided by Crane. "I shan't touch anything, but I'd like to look closely." The constable nodded, standing watchfully by the door as Miss Marple leaned over the basket, her sharp eyes scanning its arrangement. The grapes, clustered in tight bunches, cascaded over the wicker edge, their stems intertwined with the leaves that had once adorned the display. She noted a subtle irregularity. A few grapes near the center, where the peaches had been, bore a faint sheen, not the natural bloom of fruit, but something artificial, almost waxy. It was barely visible, but to Miss Marple's trained eye, it was as telling as a footprint in fresh snow. She straightened, her mind racing. The residue on the leaf, the sheen on the grapes, and Dr. Haydock's confirmation of cyanide on the peach's skin pointed to a careful application of poison, likely brushed or dabbed to ensure only one fruit was lethal. The grapes, so close to the peaches, might have been inadvertently touched during the act, leaving a trace of the poison's presence. Miss Marple pictured the scene, a hand, steady and deliberate, applying the poison in the dining room during that unguarded hour before the party. But whose hand? And how had they known Langley would choose that peach? "Constable," she said, her tone conversational, "has the laboratory confirmed whether any other fruit was tainted?" The young man, startled by her question, consulted a notebook. "Not yet, ma'am. They're still testing, but Doctor, Haydock said the cyanide was likely on the peach alone. No one else took ill, after all." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Langley's well-known fondness for peaches, a detail that had surfaced in her conversations with Clara Bell and Dr. Haydock. Someone had exploited that preference, ensuring the poison reached its intended target. The grapes, she suspected, were an accidental clue, their sheen a remnant of the killer's careful work. As she examined the basket, Miss Marple recalled the suspect's movements at the party. Mr. Harold Vance had paused near the grapes, his hand hovering briefly before withdrawing. Clara Bell had stood close to the table, her fingers brushing its edge. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, had arranged the basket and guarded it fiercely, though he admitted to leaving it unattended. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, the host, had orchestrated the event, her nervous glances suggesting a deeper involvement. Each had opportunity, but the clue in the grapes pointed to someone with both access and knowledge of Langley's habits. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes lingering on the basket. "A beautiful arrangement," she murmured, "but beauty can hide such darkness." The constable, unsure how to respond, merely nodded, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the puzzle. The poison's precision suggested a mind that calculated risks. Someone who knew Langley's preference for peaches would make the basket a perfect weapon. Vance, with his business rivalry, had dined with Langley often, likely noting his tastes. Clara, as his confidant, would know them too. Reed, responsible for the basket, had the means to tamper, and Mrs. Grayson, reliant on Langley's wealth, could have orchestrated the display to conceal her intent. Returning to the drawing room, where Inspector Crane was reviewing statements, Miss Marple shared her observations. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the grapes may hold a clue. There's a sheen on some, not unlike the residue on a leaf I found. It suggests the poison was applied with care, perhaps a brush, and the grapes were touched by accident." Crane's eyes narrowed, and he jotted a note. "Interesting, Miss Marple. The lab's testing the grapes now, but if you're right, it narrows the method. Someone with access to the basket and knowledge of Langley's habits." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You've a knack for this, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression demure. "I only notice what others overlook, Inspector. People are like my garden, full of hidden corners." Crane grunted, half amused, and returned to his notes. But Miss Marple's thoughts were already racing ahead. The clue in the grapes strengthened her suspicion of Vance, whose cold calculation matched the crime's precision. Yet Clara's debt, Reed's access, and Mrs. Grayson's financial strain kept them in her mind, each a thread in the tapestry of motive and opportunity. As she left Willow Hall, the evening air cool against her face, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her thoughts on the basket. The grapes, with their faint sheen, were a silent witness to the killer's act, a mistake that might yet betray them. She recalled her own garden, where a single misplaced seed could reveal a gardener's intent. The clue in the grapes was such a seed, and Miss Marple was determined to nurture it until the truth bloomed. With Crane's investigation pressing forward, she knew the final pieces of the puzzle were close, hidden in the shadows of human nature, where she always found her answers. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The air in Willow Hall was thick with anticipation, as if the very walls held their breath. 5 days had passed since Mr. Arthur Langley's tragic collapse, and St. Mary Mead buzzed with speculation, the village's quiet lanes alive with whispers of poison and betrayal. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat neatly buttoned and her knitting bag at her side, arrived at the manor at Inspector Crane's request. He had summoned the key suspects, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, Mr. Thomas Reed, Mr. Harold Vance, and Miss Clara Bell, for a final round of questioning, hoping to shake loose the truth. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the investigation, was permitted to attend, her reputation for unraveling mysteries earning her a quiet place in the drawing room. The room, once aglow with the warmth of chandeliers, now felt somber, its velvet drapes drawn against the late afternoon sun. The suspects sat in a loose semicircle, their faces a study in contrasting emotions. Mrs. Grayson's pale composure, Reed's fidgeting anxiety, Clara's red-rimmed eyes, and Vance's cold detachment. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace, his broad frame commanding attention, his gray eyes sharp as he surveyed the group. A constable stood by the door, notebook in hand, while Dr. Haydock lingered nearby, ready to offer medical insights. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near a window, her knitting needles clicking softly, watched each suspect with the keenness of a gardener inspecting her roses for blight. Crane began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of finality. "We've had the laboratory results," he announced, holding up a report. "The peach that killed Mr. Langley was laced with cyanide, applied to its skin with precision, likely a brush or cloth. Trace amounts were found on a few grapes nearby, suggesting the poisoner's hand slipped. This was no accident. It was a calculated act, targeting Langley alone. His gaze swept the room, lingering on each suspect. One of you knew his habits, knew he'd choose a peach, and had access to the basket. I want answers, and I want them now. Mrs. Grayson, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief, spoke first, her voice trembling. "Inspector, I've told you everything. Arthur was my cousin, my benefactor. I had no reason to harm him. His death threatens everything I've worked for." Her eyes darted to the others, as if seeking support, but found only silence. Miss Marple noted the strain in her posture, the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief, and recalled the rumors of her financial dependence on Langley. A motive, perhaps, if that dependence had become a burden. Reed, his wiry frame tense, jumped in, his words tumbling out. "I swear, Inspector, the basket was perfect when I set it out. I checked every fruit, Dawson's finest, I told you. Someone must have got to it after I brought it to the dining room. I was in and out, yes, but I didn't see anything suspicious." His voice cracked, and he wiped his brow, his apron long discarded, but his hands still restless. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. His panic was genuine, but his insistence on the basket's perfection felt like a shield, protecting either his reputation or something deeper. Clara Bell, her sapphire dress replaced by a subdued gray frock, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "Arthur was my friend, my savior," she said, her voice breaking. "I owed him money, yes, but he never pressed me. Why would I hurt him? I was near the basket, but only to talk, to keep him company." Her tears flowed freely, but Miss Marple, ever observant, noted a flicker of calculation in her expression, as if the tears were both genuine and strategic. Clara's debt, her proximity to the basket, and her knowledge of Langley's tastes made her a compelling suspect, yet her grief seemed to beg belief. Vance, seated apart, his lean frame rigid in a dark suit, met Crane's gaze with a cool stare. "I've said my piece, Inspector. Langley outbid me, cost me a fortune, but I don't settle scores with poison. I was near the basket, admiring it, nothing more. If you've evidence, show it." His voice was steady, almost defiant, and Miss Marple watched his hands, still and composed, betraying no nervousness. His calm was unnerving, a mask that could hide either innocence or cunning. Crane's jaw tightened, but before he could press further, Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her knitting needles pausing. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others wary. "The basket is indeed the key, but it's the grapes that tell the tale. The faint sheen on them, the residue on the leaf I found. It suggests the poison was applied with care, perhaps during that hour when the basket was unattended in the dining room. Whoever did this knew Mr. Langley's love of peaches, a detail not easily guessed but learned through close acquaintance." She paused, her eyes moving from one suspect to another. "Mrs. Grayson, you knew Mr. Langley's habits as family and relied on his wealth. Mr. Reed, you handled the basket and had the means to tamper, though your ambition might have stayed your hand. Miss Bell, your debt to Mr. Langley and your presence near the basket raise questions, despite your grief. But Mr. Vance—" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "You dined with Mr. Langley often, did you not? Business dinners, where you'd have noted his preference for peaches. Your loss to him was not just financial, it was personal, a blow to your pride. And you were seen near the basket, your hand hovering over the grapes." Vance's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, his composure unshaken. Crane, intrigued, leaned forward. Go on, Miss Marple. She continued, her voice calm but relentless. The poison was applied in that unguarded hour, likely with a brush, to a single peach in the cluster near the grapes. The residue on the grapes was a mistake, a slip of the hand, but it betrays the act. Mr. Vance, you visited the kitchen before the party, ostensibly to compliment Mr. Reed. But you could have slipped into the dining room, knowing the basket was there, knowing Mr. Langley's habits. Your rivalry was bitter, your losses acute. Did you see a chance to end it all? The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Grayson gasped softly, Reed's hands froze, and Clara's tears stilled. Vance's face, however, betrayed a crack in his facade, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of something in his dark eyes. "That's speculation, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You've no proof." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle but unyielding. "Proof is in the details, Mr. Vance. The grapes, the leaf, your presence, they tell a story. And people, you know, cannot hide their nature forever." Crane stepped forward, his eyes locked on Vance. "We're testing your coat, Mr. Vance, the one you wore that night. If there's even a trace of cyanide, we'll find it. Care to explain now?" Vance's composure shattered, his hands clenching into fists. "It was him or me," he said suddenly, his voice raw. "Langley ruined me, my business, my name. I couldn't let him win again. I brushed the poison on, just one peach, knowing he'd take it. I didn't mean for it to be so public, but I had no choice." The confession hung in the air, a stark admission that silenced the room. Mrs. Grayson buried her face in her hands. Reed exhaled shakily, and Clara stared, her tears forgotten. Crane nodded to the constable, who moved to restrain Vance. "You're under arrest, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice firm. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene, but her heart heavy. The truth, as always, had emerged from the smallest details, the sheen on the grapes, the leaf, the habits of a man who loved peaches. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The soft light of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a gentle glow that seemed to promise renewal after the darkness of the past week. Willow Hall, its grandeur now tinged with melancholy, stood quiet, its iron gates closed to visitors, as the village recovered from the shock of Mr. Arthur Langley's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, a pale blue scarf nearing completion in her lap. The confession of Mr. Harold Vance the previous day had unraveled the mystery. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the human frailties that had woven this tragic tapestry. Her work, she knew, was not merely in solving the crime, but in understanding the hearts that had shaped it. The village, though still abuzz with whispers, was beginning to settle. The arrest of Vance, whose cold calculation had led to the poisoned peach, had brought a measure of closure, though not without stirring sympathy for his desperation. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, reflected on the confrontation at Willow Hall, where the clue in the grapes, the faint sheen, the discolored leaf, had pointed to Vance's guilt. His rivalry with Langley, fueled by a lost contract and wounded pride, had driven him to a meticulous act of murder, using the fruit basket as a weapon tailored to Langley's known preference. It was, Miss Marple mused, a crime both precise and reckless, a paradox of human nature she had seen many times before. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, freed from suspicion, had emerged from the ordeal shaken but resolute. Miss Marple had visited her that morning, finding her in the drawing-room of Willow Hall, surrounded by letters and ledgers as she grappled with her financial future. "Miss Marple," she had said, her voice steadier now, "I owe you a great deal. If not for you, I might have been blamed. Or poor Mr. Reed. I've decided to honor Arthur's memory, his generosity, by supporting the village hospital. It's what he would have wanted." Her eyes, though tired, held a spark of determination, and Miss Marple had nodded, sensing a woman ready to rebuild. Mrs. Grayson's dependence on Langley had been a burden, but it had not driven her to murder, only to fear the consequences of his loss. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, had also begun to recover, his shop once again drawing cautious customers. The scandal had dented his reputation, but his earnest protests of innocence, coupled with Vance's confession, had restored some trust. Miss Marple had passed by his shop the previous evening, noting the care with which he polished his silver trays, a sign of his determination to reclaim his standing. "I'll never look at a fruit basket the same way," he had said with a wry smile when she stopped to offer her sympathies. "But I'm grateful to you, Miss Marple, for seeing the truth." She had smiled, her thoughts on the hour the basket had stood unattended, a window of opportunity Vance had seized. Miss Clara Bell, too, had found a path forward. Her tears, so prominent at the party, had dried, and she had confided to Miss Marple over tea that she was redoubling her efforts with her embroidery venture. "Arthur believed in me," she said, her voice firm despite the shadows under her eyes. "I'll pay back his loan, every penny, through honest work. It's the least I can do." Miss Marple had patted her hand, noting the embroidery needle still tucked into her glove, a symbol of her resolve rather than guilt. Clara's debt had cast suspicion, but her grief, though theatrical at times, had been genuine, a young woman's struggle laid bare by tragedy. As Miss Marple sat by her window, the village waking around her, she thought of the fruit basket, its beauty a mask for deadly intent. The grapes, with their faint sheen, had been the clue that broke the case, a careless slip by a man who prided himself on control. Vance, now in custody, awaited trial, his confession a stark reminder of how pride and loss could twist a heart to murder. Miss Marple's garden, visible through the window, was a mirror of her thoughts, orderly on the surface, but with hidden roots that required tending. The crime had been solved, but its roots, envy, desperation, ambition, were as old as human nature itself. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and walked to the garden, where the roses still bloomed despite the autumn chill. Bending down, she plucked a single leaf, its edges curling, and thought of the grapevine leaf that had betrayed Vance. "Small things," she murmured. "Always the small things." The village would move on, its rhythm restored, but Miss Marple knew that other secrets, other weeds, would one day surface. For now, she returned to her cottage, her mind at peace, ready to watch and listen for the next whisper of truth in St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes.